Hi everyone, welcome to this very special International Women's Day edition of BSL Talks. I'm Emily Porter, a Senior Research Fellow in the Social Policy and Research Centre at BSL, and I'm filling in for Dina Bowman, who couldn't be with us today. I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I'd like to acknowledge the many lands from which we've gathered here today, and pay respects to the traditional custodians of these lands and waterways, their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. I'd also like to acknowledge that BSL is a proud supporter of the Yes campaign for a First Nations voice to Parliament. Before we kick off today, I want to start with some housekeeping. So today we're lucky to have Jerry and Chelsea as Auslan interpreters providing captioning. Thanks, Jerry and Chelsea. We will also have time to have some questions after the main discussion. Please post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And please share any comments or thoughts you have in the chat. If you tweet, please use the following hashtags: the hashtag IWD2023 and hashtag BSL Talks. Please note this discussion is also being recorded, so you can catch up with it later if you need to drop out. So over the past 50 years, women have made great progress entering the labour market. Women's labour market participation has increased substantially from 50% of 15 to 64-year-olds in February 1978 to 76% in January this year. Over the same period, we've seen women's educational attainment surpass that of their male peers, with women now more likely to be tertiary educated. Despite this, women are more likely to work in jobs that are part-time, insecure, and undervalued, with these factors playing an important role in creating the gender pay gap. The Workplace Gender Equality Agency estimates that women on average earn $26,596 less than men each year. That's a 22.8% pay gap. This leaves women with weaker financial well-being and puts them at risk, particularly as they age. With an amazing panel today to explore the reasons behind this persistent pay gap, its impacts on women's financial security, and what we can do to improve economic security for women, I'm looking forward to a really great discussion today. We're very lucky to have joining us Professor Lynn Craig. Lynn is a Professor of Sociology and Social Policy and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Her research interests include the time impacts of children, care and social reproduction, motherhood, fatherhood and gender equity, the division of domestic labour, work and family balance, and comparative family and social policy. We also have Lisa Darmanin. Lisa is a proud and passionate unionist, beginning her association with the ASU as a member and active workplace delegate from Berry Street, Victoria in 1997. In 2018, Lisa became branch secretary of the Australian Services Union, Victorian and Tasmanian Authorities and Services branch. And prior to this, she was the first female branch executive president elected in 2014. Lisa has worked as an ASU organiser since 2000. And finally, we have Natalie Paine. Natalie is an economist and the social impact research and reporting lead at ANZ. Natalie oversees ANZ's flagship survey of financial capability and financial wellbeing in Australia. This research has underpinned ANZ's approach to community investment and the development of ANZ's financial capability programs, such as Money Minded and Saver Plus, which are delivered in partnership with BSL. Thank you all for joining us today. So Natalie, ANZ have just released a report yesterday, and I believe the link to the report will go into the chat. And this new research is focused on the financial wellbeing with a spotlight on women. Can you share some of the findings with us?
Absolutely, and thanks Emily, and thank you to the Brotherhood for having me here today to talk about this. Yes, look, we've released a deep dive into why we've been seeing a persistent gap between the financial wellbeing of men and women in Australia. And firstly, to explain financial wellbeing, essentially, it's an outcome measure. So we're looking at whether or not someone is able to meet all their commitments and needs comfortably now and has the financial resilience to do so in the future. And we've been running this survey for about 20 years now, and using the Kempson model explaining what's driving financial wellbeing. And our most recent survey, which was 2021, was really able to show that socioeconomic factors accounted for more than half of what accounts for someone's individual financial wellbeing score. So they're factors such as health, earning potential, unemployment, life journey, essentially age, gender, supporting dependents, financial stability, and access to social support. So the main sort of variables that we looked at. And then financial behaviours such as saving, spending, and long-term investing accounted for about 20% of financial wellbeing. Now, in the survey, men scored on average 66 out of 100 for their financial wellbeing, and that was 4 points higher than women at 62 out of 100. And while ideally, obviously, we don't want to be seeing any gap, what we did actually discover is that that gap persists at all age groups considered in the research. And socioeconomic factors are definitely playing a strong role here in looking at women's ability to earn, build financial resilience and financial wellbeing. So firstly, our survey highlighted that having children living at home was much more likely to impact the employment status of women and their ability to build resilience. Of all women that we looked at with dependent children at home, only 30% were working full-time compared to 67% of men in the same situation, and about 33% were working part-time compared to 18% of men with dependents at home. And the nature of living arrangements was also impacting financial wellbeing. So average financial wellbeing was highest for women living in a partnered household without children. So they scored about 71 out of 100, and lowest for women who were single parents who scored 42 out of 100. And we found too that average financial wellbeing was lower for women than men in each housing type, except for where women were living alone without dependents. Interestingly, they didn't score lower in that situation. So quite clearly, taking primary caring responsibilities in a household is impacting women's financial wellbeing, and particularly we found for women in the age groups of sort of 25 to 34 and 35 to 49, which is probably not surprising given that's when most people have dependents at home. And look, while financial wellbeing increases with age for both men and women, what we found quite surprising and concerningly was that the gap in financial wellbeing between men and women started pretty much from the get-go. So 18 to 24-year-old women on average scored financial wellbeing of 49 out of 100 compared to men in the same age group of 54. So there was this gap already starting, and it seemed to be influenced by a number of different factors. So younger women felt more anxious about their future financial situation. They felt less confident in their ability to plan and had lower investment in kind of long-term risk assets than men at the same age. They also exhibited less spending restraint, and almost half were using buy now, pay later schemes, whereas about 22% of men in that same age group were doing the same. And younger women also were much more likely to have one or more dependent children at home, also influencing their outcomes. One concern we did have too in this age group is that we noticed that more than half of young women reported their mental health as fair or poor, compared to about a third of young men. And of course, our model shows that health is one of the biggest factors impacting there. So that was quite concerning to see. So you can see, from the get-go, women are starting behind, and then those caring responsibilities and other impacts on, household employment arrangements have that cumulative impact over time on financial wellbeing. But I guess looking at something like financial resilience in particular, so, essentially building a savings buffer to deal with those shocks. Women were much more likely to report having no savings than men on average. So 17% of women had no savings compared to 10% of men. And this gap was much higher for women, aged in that 35 to 49 age group, where it was about 22% of women reported having no savings compared to 12% of men. So quite a significant difference. And women in that age group also found that they were sort of borrowing for everyday expenses more often. So about a quarter were saying that they, always or often or sometimes had to borrow money for food or expenses because they were running short. And that was compared to 14% of men in that age group too. So that's quite a big difference. And I mean, I guess when we look at these savings and spending outcomes being much lower, this is despite the fact that our research really showed on average women had more of a savings mindset. So they were much more likely to say they found it more satisfying to save than spend. They were just as likely as men to say they tried to save, even if only a small amount. And, more than half said they tried to put money aside for unexpected expenses as well. So you can really see the desire to save and build resilience is there, but those socioeconomic factors are limiting those savings outcomes for women and their overall financial well-being. And definitely we see that as far as building longer term resilience goes as well, in terms of building those assets that they then can rely on in retirement. And women were much more likely to be accessing a government pension in retirement than men were.
Thanks, Natalie. That's really interesting and important research, but shows us quite a stark picture. I think it's really important, the point you raised around socioeconomic factors rather than individual characteristics really driving these impacts. Then you've spent a lot of time researching this. Are you able to give us a bit of a background on what these are and what the effects are on women?
Yes, I think it's really interesting. It's wonderful research. Thanks very much, Natalie. But yes, what seems to be behind this is that we've got structural issues about women being responsible for care. So when we think about them in the workforce, we have to think about the domestic situation from which they're coming. There's a sort of, once you get out the door as a man or a woman, you've come from a different background. You're coming from a kind of an edifice of relationships and customs and norms that have been embedded into how people can arrange their work and family affairs. And so obviously the gender division of labour is long established and ongoing. And so despite a lot of change in women's workforce participation, things can't be addressed only from the public sphere. The work situation needs to change as much as the women do. And really at the moment, there's so much desire for women to achieve in the workplace and achieve in education, and that's shown in the very high tertiary education rates of women in this country. Young men also have higher education rates than in the past, but the women are truly spectacular. And so there's no lack of evidence of wanting to do well, to get the kind of financial security that Natalie was talking about, or the capacity to do that. But systematically, women are affected by having care responsibilities, and it begins, when you have children. But even before that, it's kind of anticipated that it seems to be anticipated in the workforce, and even entry-level work is not at a par, but it does compound over the lifetime. Another factor is that women's work, the feminized industries, tend to pay less. Even for quite high level educative requirements, it's quite noticeable that the professionalization of roles like nursing and care work that used to be not require you to run up HECS debt or to put yourself behind in that regard, they're generally female dominated. So we have a kind of triple whammy happening here with women getting more educated, being likely to be charged more for equivalent kind of earning capacity as men. Trade still don't mean you acquire the same debt to get them, but your earning capacity is higher. And a lot of women are still hoping to take jobs that allow them to be flexible around their caring responsibilities, but often end up having to take individual risk on that, take casual work, part-time work. And if we have a retirement income system that requires you to contribute over your working lifetime, having less time in the labour market as well as lower pay obviously accumulates to make it very difficult, no matter how keen you are or able you are to manage your finances, you just don't have the capacity to do that. complicated also by the fact that most solo parents are women, so they have other, they've got dependence on them in a way that men don't have in the same numbers, and that makes them more exposed to the kind of policies that could assist with work and family. So they're more likely to be needing to pay for childcare, even in dual earner families. It's often, seen as an impost on the women's contribution to the family coffers, and for many it's line ball on whether it actually is worth it in terms of time allocation. Paid parental leave, taking time out of the workforce, obviously that's a really important thing for child health and mental health of the mother and those sort of things, but it can be costly coming back in. We could see that the impact of COVID was more on women in terms of caring and initial loss of jobs. The cost of living crisis is affecting women more because they have more to balance and people dependent on them, and also generally lower wages. So we need to be thinking about how women's enormous efforts in juggling all this and equipping themselves with the workforce can actually be made to work for them. Because I just would like to emphasise how important this is for the country and the society, that this work gets done. It's not like it's a choice in the sense of, obviously one of the telling things you said there, Natalie, was that if women don't have, if they're single and they don't have a partner and they don't have children, they're doing financially as there's no difference between them and the men. But we as a society can't all. It's a dead end route if that's what everybody does. So we need to make it work for women's health and well-being, and really for the society to function properly.
Thanks, Lynn. It's really important to note just women are doing so much work that is unpaid, but also to note that a lot of the work that women do in the labour market is also undervalued or underpaid. Lisa, you represent a lot of women in sort of traditionally female-dominated sectors who provide really vital care work in the sort of care and social services sector. Can you tell us what the impact of some of these challenges described by Lynn and Natalie are on your members?
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and thanks for the invitation to speak today, to be part of this really important discussion. So our union represents workers in social and community services, local government, and some parts of the public sector, and many of those industries predominate in women, and we've got a higher female membership, and a lot of the work is based around care. So I thought to kind of give colour to, I think, what Natalie and Lynn have talked about in terms of the drivers of these things is, some live examples of what we see happening right now in our industries. So, and I think that they are, they're both, these particular examples are driven by challenges around how we fund and value the work of caring that is mostly done by women. And I would contend that society and economic systems don't value their work in the same way as other sorts of work contributes to our economy. So, for example, we've seen a Royal Commission into the aged care sector. There is a lot of reform required in that sector, and mostly women perform that work. We represent in-home aged care workers who have been delivering that work predominantly through local councils over many years in Victoria. And because of the increasing marketisation of aged care, without the subsequent funding to properly recognise the work and wages of those workers, we're seeing councils increasingly withdraw from this service delivery. And I was talking to a carer last week from Ballarat who is imminently about to lose her job because Ballarat is no longer providing those services. She's worked in the sector for more than 20 years. She's got a certificate she's highly educated and dedicated to the community that she serves. She doesn't do the job for the money. Her son earns more working at Domino's in his part-time job than she does doing the job she's done for 20 years. Yet her employer is getting out because, they don't want to compete in a marketised system. And these workers in councils have managed to eke out better paying conditions than those in the private sector. she can get better paid work working at Domino's. So we're going to see these women continue to leave if the arrangements about how we value their work is not taken seriously by our decision makers and policy makers. And you know, it drives down not only wages, but also the quality of service and the dignity to our elderly community in the service that we think they deserve. And I guess another example in terms of funding is in the homelessness sector right now. So we represent workers who work in the homelessness sector. In 2012, some of you might recall that the ASU won an equal pay case for workers across community services, which was essentially about closing the gender pay gap. It was funded by the federal government to the tune of about $2 billion at that time. That decision has fully worked through the system now, gave people pay rises between 15 and 37%, which is the amount of money they were undervalued for their work. But the federal contribution to that fund, to that sector in homelessness is no longer guaranteed. Unfortunately, the current Labor government hasn't included these rises in the new National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. So yet again, like, we're having to re-prosecute these arguments about properly valuing the work of mostly women. I think finally the last point that I would make in terms of challenges of you know, everybody on this call would list many others, but I think it comes down to, as I said earlier, not valuing women's work. And the way that I think about it is that women build, in these caring sectors, they are building social infrastructure. We see physical infrastructure well-funded and supported by our governments. So when we build a road or we remove a level crossing, we contract a private provider who not only pays their workers properly on an enterprise agreement rate with overtime, penalty rates, all the rest of it. The company who delivers that service also makes a profit, and the taxpayers fund these things. Yet when we build social infrastructure, we have charities who are begging to provide their workers a decent wage. And I just don't think that's right. And I think that is a systemic and a structural challenge that affects all of our women. And I think, yeah, that's, anyway, I'll stop there because otherwise I'll just carry on.
Thanks, Lisa. That's such a good example of the way that women's work is undervalued. I mean, the fact that an aged care worker can earn more at Domino's rather than providing a really vital service that, you know, we're all going to need one day. And it really is social infrastructure. It keeps society together. And we saw the impact during COVID when you do take away essential services like childcare, the impact on people and families. I want to go back to something Lynn raised around the impact of the cost of living crisis on women and how women are more impacted. Natalie, in your research, have you seen any impacts from the current cost of living crisis on women and whether that's been different to the impacts on men?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And it's not surprising that, you know, combination of all these factors, which are, you know, leading to women generally having lower average incomes than men and less ability to build resilience, all those sorts of things is going to have an impact during, you know, these sorts of pressures. Look, we've been able to track financial wellbeing over time with the financial wellbeing indicator, which we do in partnership with Roy Morgan. And that has shown, like, if we look at 2022, that period sort of January to September, where, you know, we've seen obviously, you know, starting there that, you know, massive rise in prices and obviously other household pressures and interest rates and the like. Financial wellbeing on the whole fell about 2.4% for nationally in Australia, but we did see the biggest fall was really for people in lower income households. So they fell more like 3.3% essentially. And of course, we know that those lower income households are generally, you know, women are overrepresented in lower income households too. And when we look at it, looking at, you know, men and women, we actually saw that for men during that period, you know, financial wellbeing fell about 1.8%, whereas for women it was 2.8%. So the reason why it fell is that, obviously those cost of living pressures, but how people were feeling about their current financial situation. So really that consumer confidence side was having a strong impact for both men and women in the fall of how we measure financial well-being. But for women, we saw a real reduction in their ability to meet commitments, whereas that stayed pretty stable for men in the measure. So for women, they definitely are sitting there, with less buffer to draw on and lower incomes. And so when those prices rise, that is definitely having more of an effect on their ability to meet commitments. And I would say during the pandemic, it was quite interesting to see, as much as women's industries were heavily affected, that during that second half of 2020, when some of those extra supports were in place, we did see the financial wellbeing between men and women, that gap narrow during that time. And I know, certainly with the Brotherhood, with the research that you did around financial lives in uncertain times, that really highlighted the impact of those extra supports on people on lower incomes, on women, particularly single mothers, and that extra support, certainly for people at the lower end, did have an effect on their financial well-being and their ability to meet commitments. So interestingly, since 2021, 2022, we've seen that gap diverge again back to what it was. So, when increased cost of living and the removal of some of those extra supports, that seems to have impacted women.
Thanks, Natalie. That's really interesting, and really it goes to Lynn's point around women being much more exposed to sort of policy changes and much more reliant on having those supports available. Lisa, given what you were saying about wages in some of the sectors you represent, I imagine the impacts of the current cost of living crisis on some of your members would be quite intense as well.
Yeah, I think the other point that I would make about cost of living is that for women in caring sectors, and we saw this also during COVID, is that it's a double whammy, because others who are having financial difficulties are more reliant on the social and community services that are being provided by our members. So they are seeing an increase in the people that are seeking their support. So not only are they seeing it at home themselves and suffering in their own pay packets if they can afford a mortgage, many of which can't, but the workload is increasing. And so the burnout on them is having an impact as the high workload continues to get higher. And, it's really making some of them think about, well, do I really want to work in this sector? And, this cycle of, having a high turnover of staff, which drives down quality of service. And so it is a vicious cycle that women are really at the front line of.
Thanks, Lisa. We've definitely been hearing the same thing, and it definitely goes to that sort of the social infrastructure that women provide, or predominantly female industries provide, really isn't being supported, particularly when it's needed the most during these crises. Lynn, did you want to add anything else on the cost of living crisis?
I'd actually like to pick up on that point of social infrastructure. I think part of the issue is the long-time invisibility of the absolute essential nature of what care is. And you can equate it with, the rather belated willingness to count in the environmental costs of, environmental depredation. It's a cost that was not factored in and so ignored. And what's striking about the continuation of women's difficulties in this regard, and always being more vulnerable because they have less resources and usually more people to care for, is that it's just invisible in a way. It seems like a costless good that is just provided, and the more the society changes so that things that used to be possible, like living, 5 people in the Harvester judgment, living on one income from the male breadwinner, it's liberation to bring women into the paid workforce and get independence, but it now requires that extra wage, and things that used to be paid for it, as services, and much more affordable to ordinary wage earners, like housing, have just ratcheted up and up and up as things have become marketized. So privatizing and making profit motive into essential services is completely unsustainable. Once you do that, then the providers, as Lisa says, are constrained. They can't do it. They can't make money out of it. They can't deliver. And it's actually it's essential for everybody that they do. So, but it can't be made in an individual thing like that. So what seems to have gone is this shared social risk of people being funded to do something that is essential. And once you start to name it as such, well, I think probably is helpful to use terms like social infrastructure and put a name to it, identify its importance in making things work, and then perhaps we can get recognition of it. The most simple way of recognising all the care work has just been called for by the Select Committee on Work and Care, the Senate Select Committee, and one of their first interim recommendations was to get to address the data poverty around this. We simply don't know how much time people are spending in care. Who we know generally it's more likely to be women, but who in particular, and which women, and how can that be addressed? But also just you could put an economic value on that. You can give a putative value, and people like the UN Women, it's been widely argued worldwide that there should be it should be attached to satellite accounts to GDP, and so it's got some kind of basis there. But of course, living it is the real challenge for women. I mean, it's all very well to have a putative value put on all the work you do, and it certainly would be good to recognise it. But the stress of managing all this is really coming out. And it was very clear in the COVID period. Several things. It was quite a lot of distress on women who were balancing work and family, but also those temporary supports, the removal of commuting from people's day, the ability to be at home and be flexible in that way with no detriment to your how the employer would see you, and all those things. And really that very brief experiment, which of course the rise in job seeker as well. I mean, it was a clearly doable thing for at least that period, and it had measurable benefits in well-being and security. And now it's all just reverting to square one. But we're not. It's not sustainable to keep making individuals take the risk of what's actually. There used to be things built in, and they've been systematically removed. And yes, I mean, as Lisa says, you can't go on doing a job because you love it that doesn't pay a living wage, unless you're in a situation where you can manage without a living wage, because I don't know, you can live on it, but you can't now.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's a really good point around, women are essentially just and the unpaid care work that women do, and sometimes the undervalued paid care work that women do, are really propping up the economy, but at the same time are facing more and more pressures in terms of reduced wages, increased housing costs, inadequate social security, and all of these things are sort of snowballing to the point where we can't keep going with how we're doing without sort of recognising the need to really invest in that social infrastructure and support the women who are sort of holding up the economy and holding up our society. So I think this is a really good point to start getting into what needs to change to actually address these problems and create some long-term solutions. While we're doing this, please, if you've got any questions for the panel, pop them into the Q&A, because we're really interested to get your thoughts and feedback. But Lynn, I might go back to you. What do you think are the priorities to solve these issues?
I think it needs to be a whole suite of things. It's a very difficult problem, and it needs to be solved from lots of angles. And so the most obvious is childcare should be affordable and accessible and flexible. And that's there is some movement already to make it cheaper, but as it's currently been, it's systematically made it almost not worth it financially for women to work more than part-time, and that has embedded our full-time male part-time female partnership that's kind of makes it so difficult for women to plan over their lifetimes to be secure in old age. So, and that should be bolstered by more paid parental leave, obviously, with super contributions on that, but also there's tax arrangements that need to be addressed in tandem with the childcare policies, so that the high marginal tax on people if they're working more than those 2 or 3 days a week, combined with childcare, is what makes it non-economic. I'd really like to think about why we need to have a contributory retirement system when we have a very entrenched female carer, a primary carer pattern over the lifetime, and think about what's actually a more gender equitable retirement arrangement of having a non-contributory benefit paid as pension that's a living wage. So we just seem to be putting salt in the wound of making it very, very difficult for women to find themselves in that position over the working lifetime, and then to be penalised for it. And as we all know, that's leading to very high levels of increase in older women's homelessness, and it's unsustainable and unequitable. I'd also like to say, I think that the idea that we can get men to do more in the home and women to take up more paid work and, thus increase productivity. And, it is an untapped resource in this country, women's education and work capacity. But if the solution is women do more paid work and men do more unpaid work, what I'm hearing when I hear that is everybody should work harder and longer than they already are. And so I think as a society, we have to be willing, if men to do more in the home, that they'll be doing fewer work hours. It should, that's another reason I would think counting up the hours in paid and unpaid work is really telling, because if you do that, actually, Australian households work long hours compared to other parts of the world. For instance, the social democracies in the Nordic countries is not coincidentally based on much lower working hours. So it's easier to have more gender equitable home arrangements if everybody's not working much more than a 40-hour week. If average paid working hours are much longer than that, then it is just that much more stressful. So I also just like to touch on the gig economy and insecure work, and as part of this, not sharing the risks, people paying just for the work that's done, employers changing shifts so they're unpredictable. It makes it very difficult for anyone to plan around their care needs. And that means they're more likely to take the jobs that will allow flexibility at the cost of security and adequate income.
Thanks, Lynn. I think there's some really important points, particularly around the intersection between care and work, and women's need for flexible work and work that allows them to balance care responsibilities. But for a lot of women, that means taking on really insecure work, and that means really insecure incomes, which can lead to some of the financial stress that Natalie was talking about. Lisa, I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on this issue.
Yeah. I was going to say some things about structural reform of the superannuation system. Lynn talked about that at the beginning and then again just now, and she's gone more radical than I have. But I agree that there is certainly a need to look at how the system is designed so that it suits the working patterns of everybody who works in our society, not just the men, which is what that system was designed for, that you worked from the age of 15 to 55 full time, and that's it. And that is not the lives of many women in our community, as we know. So I totally agree that it needs a complete overhaul, and there's many different ways to go about that. But I think the thing I would also say about that is it's urgent. We've been talking about this for a long time, and the thing about superannuation is it compounds over someone's working life. So each year that goes by that we talk about this and nothing much changes, our children and our children's children are still going to be in retirement, our children's daughters. So, this is an urgent problem that needs addressing. I think there's a lot in the workspace, obviously. There's some interesting discussions happening in Australia around the 4-day week movement. And I think to Lynn's point, if we think about work across the household, that it's 4 days a week at the same pay, not at lesser pay, and ideally for women it would be at more pay, but it's to enable that sharing of the burden of care in a household across the whole family. And I think that there's opportunities in that if it's about redesigning how we do our work so that it is more evenly spread. I think that I've talked about funding for women's work and, recognising the economic contribution and measuring it in that way, as opposed to this is how much it costs to care and it's too expensive and, how can we possibly afford to pay women what they're worth in aged care and community services? I mean, that's just ridiculous. But we need to, what gets measured gets managed. And so, Lynn's, points about measuring these things, I think, is important to push for, because then we make the arguments as to what we lose if we lose these workers in our community. I think the final thing that I would say is that I think there is some hope around some of the changes in the federal workplace laws that have recently been adopted, some of which are in place now and some will be progressively implemented over the next 12 months. Things like the Fair Work Act now will have an object to promote job security and gender equality, which wasn't there before. Previously, gender equality was only recognised indirectly, and it was a concept that was very narrowly interpreted by courts and tribunals. This expansion of that consideration means that the Fair Work Commission will need to consider gender equality when they're setting terms and conditions in modern awards and when setting minimum wages. So I think that's a really significant change that we obviously need to push cases to test, but it's an opportunity that hasn't been there before. Along with achieving substantial equality through enterprise agreements. So for those of us who are in the business of bargaining, we can start to now make claims to address the gap by, for example, negotiating additional superannuation contributions only for women workers. Previously, that was very difficult to do and seen as discriminatory. And we would have to jump through a lot of hoops to kind of justify a position like that. But now we are able to bargain to have affirmative action type arrangements in agreements that's much broader. There's a lot of stuff about addressing systemic sexual harassment and discrimination, a positive duty on employers now to take steps to eliminate sexual harassment in their workplace. Sexual harassment, is a driver of gender inequality. So, stamping out those kinds of behaviours is part of the puzzle to fix. And finally, there's been some barriers removed about running equal remuneration or equal pay cases. So, our union did achieve some success a number of years ago, but the aged care sector and the early childhood workers have had real difficulties more recently in running equal pay cases to have their work valued. Some barriers in the legislation have been removed that will hopefully make that easier, along with the establishment of a couple of expert panels in the Fair Work Commission. One is the pay panel and another one is the community sector panel. And we'll see how these things evolve, but I think a spotlight in this area in the workplace is really needed and an exciting development that we should make the most of.
Thanks, Lisa. It's great to hear some positive news in amongst some of the less than positive things we've been talking about today, and good to know that some of the industrial relations changes pave the way for positive changes for female workers. One thing that's really come through in this discussion, and I know, Lynn, you mentioned this at the start, that women really face a different reality, like women's needs and the structures and opportunities that women face are different because of the care responsibilities that are placed on them and the gendered division of labour. and we do need to sort of really change the way we think about and centre care in our society and in our economy. That's a pretty massive task, and it involves us, thinking very differently about the role of care. I know recently, in response to the cost of living crisis, the RBA governor suggested that everyone could just go out and pick up some more work hours, whereas we know from our own research that women often can't take on more work because they don't have access to transport or childcare, or are already exhausted just from looking after children and providing that really vital care work. So I'm interested to get the insights of the panel on what you think is needed to really change the role of care in our society. What are the first steps that we should be taking? Anyone want to jump in on this? Not at all.
I'll go first, and then maybe others can follow with something. I won't say more constructive, but I think we just have to start getting angrier about these things. Like, every year we talk about this. We know the problems, but like, we have to be bold and we have to push our policymakers and decision makers and hold them accountable. And I think that there is opportunity to make change, but we have to be really bolshy about these things. And I think perhaps a good example is, what I talked about in terms of some of the changes to the new legislation in workplaces. I mean, that came about because of, what we saw under the previous government, and Brittany Higgins and the Human Rights Commission, and the report that came out arising out of what happens in our Commonwealth Parliament as a workplace. But, there was a frenzy around that, and then a lot of work put in by a lot of people to push for change. So I think it's possible, but we have to really unite to hold people accountable in whatever forums we are active in, and including our own workplaces, and how we can push our own workplaces to contribute to these discussions as well. Because, for example, family violence leave, is another issue that, that's now a national standard. That came about from one workplace who fought really hard to get that in their workplace, and then another one, and then another one, and then Victoria picked it up as a public policy issue, and then we pushed other states, and then we made it federal law. So it takes time, but we've got to get angry and organise ourselves.
Yes, I think we need to keep saying how much it is. I mean, there's only so many hours in the day. If you're working and you're caring and you're commuting, you don't have time to take extra work. And I remember Joe Hockey saying some time ago, he wanted everybody to get better jobs, so that nurses got paid more or whatever. But, if you're a government employee, it's capped. You can't work more hours if you have no more hours to work. And I think being angry and just repeating it. I mean, the interesting thing about the superannuation thing is it took 30 years to become really obvious. Like, I mean, this system has only been in place since the mid-90s or so. And it was completely obvious at the time that it did not take into account women's lifetime organisation of work and care. But it started getting traction when you had men and women retiring with different account balances. And it was just like, oh, why was that? And, well, for the reasons had been said all along. And then if the reaction to that is to say, well, women should be in the workforce for longer and doing more. Well, what are you going to do about the reasons that they're not? There are long-standing reasons they're not. They've been talked about forever, and they're compounded, as you say, by discrimination in the workforce, vulnerability of women to domestic and intimate family violence. It's known, it's recognised, and yet it just seems to drop away when the solutions to the cost of living are put by someone like the Reserve Bank governor. It's gender blind, and gender blindness is just not going to cut it. It's really far too late for that, and we need to be saying this is a gender story and we need it to be addressed.
I think also,
I'm sorry, Natalie, just to say, I agree, there is an opportunity. I think there's receptivity in the polity now that we haven't had before. And I think, so that's all the more reason to just say it out and loud.
I was just going to add too that I think when we talk about caring responsibilities, everyone turns their mind to, very young children. And something that often gets forgotten is how long caring responsibilities actually last throughout a life. So whether they're young children, school-age children, getting into sort of late teenage years, there's still quite a lot of demands on parents at home. And then often, which often falls to, the responsibility falls to women as well, is that, your parents, at that stage too, women will often have caring responsibilities for their parents around that stage. So there seems to be, I guess, just forgetting how long that caring responsibility does last, and that it does have an impact throughout, quite substantially throughout someone's timeline. So certainly, when we see it in our data, I mean, it's still, women getting towards 50, it's still, 29, 30% working part-time predominantly. So it's still very high at that stage. It's not a case of women are having kids, a bit of caring responsibility, and then we can all go back full-time because, as Lynn says, that, there's only so many hours in a day and people have those other responsibilities they need to deal with.
That's a great point, Natalie. And for many people, even once children are grown up, then it may come to caring for elderly parents or caring for children with a disability or other chronic illnesses. So I think we need to recognise that care is something that isn't done in a few years and then put on the shelf. It's something that's ongoing and part of our life. And I think it's really interesting, some of the points that we discussed around some of the market structures around care. So we in the past 30 years, we've moved to a lot of commercially driven or private provision of care, and that hasn't always delivered the right things. Do we need to be thinking about different models for providing care and different models for funding care to ensure that it's valued appropriately?
I think care is entirely inappropriate to be provided in a market-based system. We've come a long way down that track. Privatisation began with, it's ironically probably the earliest candidate for renationalisation is energy now. But if you have anything that is vital for life and it's put under the profit motive, you've got problems when it can't be delivered. And yes, I would like to see not-for-profit and government-provided services. Universal basic services is often talked about as an alternative. Some people, universal basic income as a way of coping with, making sure everybody has an adequate amount to live on. But if everybody's just trying to buy what they need individually, it's actually less useful and sustainable than if the services were being provided at cost through the tax system. But again, I'm not sure how much we'd have to walk back to get to that, but it seems to me entirely inappropriate. And it's really obvious in aged care that this should be regarded as a profit-making enterprise.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree. And I think we should be learning from other countries that have gone down this path and it's failed, like in the UK, like we are doing the same things in the social care sector that they did some time ago, have been suffering as a result. But I just wanted to go back to the Natalie's point, and also there's a question that talks about it's not just about children. I think the other point about that, I'm no expert, but in the area of gender equality and the entrenched gender roles in our homes that perpetuate throughout our lives, like it's got to start at the beginning. Like I've got 2 little boys aged 6 and 9 now, but right from the beginning they pick things up at home and at kinder and in childcare that become the norm throughout their lives. And so the intervention has to start really early, because it becomes an unconscious expectation around what people's roles are in the homes. And so, as I said, I'm no expert, but, I did a little bit of work around the gender equality strategy in Victoria a couple of years ago. And, there are some interventions, and there's research that shows that those expectations do start really early in those settings. And so if we can turn that around, then we're breeding a new generation that doesn't have the same expectations about who makes the bed and does the washing and the cooking and the shopping and all the rest of the things that we do.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I'd just like to say, yeah, research does show that young people particularly much more wish to be involved. And I think there'd be certainly a great deal of willingness if the structural barriers to having work shared more equally and not trying to make sure that that babies and men, women go part-time. I think there would be willingness. What we need to do is take away the barriers to it, and I think cultural change is already there and would follow.
Thanks, Lynn and Lisa and Natalie. I would love to continue this conversation because it's so fascinating, and there's so much that we could continue to explore. But unfortunately, we are coming up to time. So I just want to thank you all again for your amazing contribution. Also want to thank, there's been some great comments in the chat and a great question that's been put there, and would love to have had time to explore all of those comments and questions a bit further. One thing that's really come out of this conversation is just the idea that women face a really different reality, and we need to apply a gender lens to everything if we're going to address the gender pay gap, and that involves some really big change, both inside the home and at the societal level. But we can, I think what's been really positive for me today is just hearing that there's some really strong ideas that we can take forward and work happening right now that will start to make those changes. We need to ensure that the vital paid and unpaid work that women do is valued effectively, and that requires both an adequate social security system, adequate childcare, and decent, secure, well-paid work. Please keep the conversation going. Read our research, read Natalie's report, and if you've got any other thoughts or questions to share, please use the hashtag on Twitter and keep the conversation going. Thank you all for attending, and see you later. Bye.